Welcome back to the Florida History Podcast. I'm Carter Krishnaiyer.
And I'm Robert Bucciolato.
The very final naval battle between the British forces and the Patriot forces took place right off the coast of Florida in March of 1783. I've actually visited where the historic marker is on Merritt Island, but the battle obviously did not take place on Merritt Island. It took place out to sea. One of the most important figures in American history that for some reason no one ever talks about, Robert Morris, along with Gouverneur Morris, his brother, who was also, although I saw recently Richard Brookhiser, who was a National Review conservative, right? Obviously is a protege of William F. Buckley. I saw recently he had written a biography of Gouverneur Morris, which,
Really?
yeah, which I actually think maybe, even though I don't necessarily align with Brookhiser politically, I'm thinking, Robert, that's probably worth a purchase. I need to find it at thrift books or someplace because it's probably really interesting. Fascinating character, the Morris brothers. Robert Morris, basically, without him, I don't know that the United States achieves independence. Right? He financed so much of what the Continental Congress was able to allocate to the Continental Army to keep the struggle going. And in late 1782, we're not sure yet how peace negotiations are going in Paris, right?
Could go either way.
Yeah, word is very slow getting back to the colonies, and we're going to talk about this next week when we conclude the series. But there was, I think it's important to set the context here. There was still some pessimism among American ranks, right? George Washington continued to be obsessed with liberating New York City, which was still occupied by the British. Numbers were swelling in St. Augustine. There was still the fear that, the British have so much going on in Florida that they could, in East Florida, they could easily maybe invade Georgia again and try and take Savannah. And we would be back in a conflict, right? It was not understood completely, although there was optimists that the Whigs had gotten power in Westminster and that they wanted to end the war, and obviously peace negotiations are going on. But it wasn't assumed that would be successful. Speak to this a little bit.
At least not as generous of a peace as what ended up happening.
Correct. That's a great point. So more on that in the next episode, but I want to set the context as to why we're talking about battles in 1782 and 1783, because the common narrative now is that the war ended at Yorktown in late 1781. It was not seen that way at the time. It was seen as a decisive victory for the Americans and the French, but it was not the end of the war. And in fact, as we said last week, the British invaded the Bahamas, launched an invasion from St. Augustine to liberate the Bahamas, to liberate Nassau and New Providence. In this period of 1783, early 1783, there were battles going on in the Caribbean. There were naval battles going on in the North Atlantic between American ships and British ships, French ships and British ships. There were some battles going on the Indian subcontinent. So the war was not over. And so Robert Morris, who I mentioned earlier, had arranged to take a shipload of Spanish gold and other silver from Havana to Philadelphia because they needed the money for the Continental Congress. They needed money to keep things going. So Captain John Barry was sailing in the USS Alliance from Martinique to Havana and then onward to Newport, Rhode Island. So he was going to then take the gold from Havana to Philadelphia, then go to Newport. There was another U.S. ship captained by John Green that was going to sail to make sort of a convoy. So this convoy is coming, and there are 3 British ships that are stationed in the area because Nassau, New Providence, there's an effort to liberate it. It hasn't been liberated just yet by the British, but of course they're launching the invasion from Florida. They hold Florida and they're patrolling the waters. They have supremacy. The Royal Navy obviously had supremacy in so many places. They still have supremacy off the waters of Florida at this point, of East Florida. So the HMS Sybil, captained by James Vashon, and then 2 other British ships, the HMS Alarm and HMS Tobago, engaged in battle. And after a long, drawn out battle, which included a sixth ship, a French ship, realizing that their American allies were under attack, they race to the scene. They get there toward the end. The Americans ended up winning with the assistance of the French ship. The French frigate was called the Triton, and this left about 40 dead on the Sybil, which was James Vachon, Captain Vachon's his ship. And so the three British ships defeated, tried to flee, and the American and French fleets pursued them until then they were able to evade and get back to harbor in Florida, in East Florida. At that point, the French ship, peeled off, and the American ships sailed to their destination in Philadelphia. But this last piece of naval battle took place off the coast of East Florida because there was still a war going on, Robert. And quite frankly, with this fortress colony we're talking about that East Florida had become between 1780 and 1784, that was the place where the British, if they were going to stop the American ships, the line from Havana all the way north to Philadelphia, this was the place they could stop them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm shocked by just how many times a important element or touchstone of this conflict took place in Florida, and how often we just sort of skirted over it. And I mean, I had no idea that something as pivotal and as decisive as the last naval engagement took place here. I had no idea that it took place at such a late stage in the game. I, like you, kind of thought, oh, well, Yorktown, that was it. It was over. Writing was on the wall. All they could do then is just bicker about the terms in Paris. I think what's so interesting about this whole little escapade of the smuggling of the gold and this last gasp sort of altercation between an emerging naval power, at least that's what it seemed at the time America might be, and the Titan of the sea, the British Empire, taking place while all of these other components on two different continents were forming, is to just get a real sense again of how much of a global struggle this war truly was. People, again, just sort of think that it was reserved to these 13 colonies, and they had no idea that at the same time, the British were fighting in every continent that they had territory. They, whether it was the native populace that said, okay, well, now's the time to attack them when they're weak, or it was the French or the Spanish in other parts of the world. And this, again, just shows just the logistical scope of this conflict.
Yep, absolutely, Robert. Real quickly before we conclude this episode, why do you think in American history we were never taught about? I'm just asking for a theory here about the period after Yorktown, because like you, I believe that, and I have to say, in the last 10 years or so, I've gotten fascinated by the period between November of 1781 and 1784, and actually become fascinated by the Articles of Confederation and what actually happened between Yorktown and the Constitutional Convention, because so little of it is taught to us in American history. It's almost like those 6 years didn't happen.
Well, I think one of the reasons it just boils down to the fact that there was not a signer here for Florida. There was not a delegate. So Florida missed the drama of 1776, the drama of what was happening in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. And so there was that. There was the fact that there was really no native son of Florida that was on the colonial side that played a prominent role. And the fact that we were just sort of in a lot of ways, for a lot of the conflict and for much of the forming of the nation, we were sort of a sideshow. We were sort of that's kind of the thing that most Floridians always sort of have to contend with, is the fact that we're at least at the founding, we were sort of an adjunct member of the country. So there's that, but there's also the fact that the mythos that has really formed over the last 100 years since the centennial in 1876 talks about Franklin. It talks about Jefferson. It talks about Washington. It really wasn't until the bicentennial when John Adams became center stage again, when Patrick Henry became center stage again. For a long time, it was really reserved. The Titans, the mythos was around a few central figures in a few central colonies, and that was sort of the narrative. That was our nationality, and Florida has always been a place that has beckoned a transient and a fluid citizenship. And so it's America, but it's also the Caribbean. It's also Spanish. It's also British. It's all of these different nationalities. So it doesn't fit in that box the way that a Virginia or a Pennsylvania does.
Okay, Robert, great points, and let's conclude there for this week. So next week we're going to talk about the treaties of Paris and Versailles and the loyalists who had swelled St. Augustine to being at this point as populated as Philadelphia or Boston or New York and more so than Charleston and Savannah. What happens to them when the peace is signed? East Florida is ceded to Spain, and we go into a phase where over the course of about a year and a half to 2 years, this huge population, which we were already talking about logistically having a hard time settling, we talked about that a few weeks ago, where they go and what happens with them, and how this transition back to Spanish rule takes place. And if, in fact, the influence of the British wanes, even though they cede East Florida, because I would argue it didn't really wane. They continued to have a great deal of influence over internal affairs, particularly through their relationship with the Seminole and other Native American tribes. Continued to have a lot of influence over what happened in the areas that are now part of the state of Florida.